Recently, American History TV was at the American Historical Association's annual meeting in Denver, Colorado. We spoke with professors, authors, and graduate students about their research. This interview is about 15 minutes.
We're with Eugene Hillsman, a Princeton University PhD candidate. Tell us what some of the early examples of early recreational or personal uses of marijuana in the United States.
Yeah, in the United States, I think it really became popular in the late 19th and early 20th century, right? So you see it kind of constantly associated with jazz musicians in the 30s and 40s, the beatnik generation, kind of hippies in the 60s, right? But, you know, it was prescribed by doctors in the late 19th century around a number of psychological issues, thinking about things like anxiety, for example. And so in North America, particularly with Mexican immigrants who kind of came to the United States, really helped popularize the association with marijuana in the late 19th century.
So it was legal for medicinal purposes and for recreational purposes?
Well, so states started to criminalize marijuana policy as early as kind of if you're thinking about 1900. So by 1931, you have 29 states that have already decided to criminalize marijuana possession. And so in thinking about kind of what the federal government was responding to, there was already the attitude that substances like marijuana should be illegal. But the real issue came with the mechanisms to do so, right? So thinking about the early 20th century, the federal government didn't have a lot of confidence, right, in the laws that it was implementing. So in 1937, the federal government passed the Marijuana Tax Act, right, which was actually part of the Department of Treasury instead of the Department of Justice or the analog. And so what they decided to do was essentially issue a stamp to doctors who wanted to prescribe marijuana. And then the federal government never issued the stamps, right? So in theory, you could imagine a system in which doctors were still able to prescribe marijuana, but in practice, they weren't able to because the federal government would never issue the clearance for doctors to actually do so.
Back us up for a bit
sure.
on the 29 states and others that made it illegal. What caused them to make marijuana legal?
And this is similar to drug policy in a number of examples, right? Often identify with marginalized communities, right? So you have the example of opium restrictions in California, right? And thinking about drug dens, people who are frustrated with kind of development, concerned about influx of others in a number of circumstances, and we have situations in which there was a lot of dissatisfaction with African Americans in the South. There were stories of people who were using cocaine and becoming superhuman, right? Bullets couldn't stop them. And so this is driving a lot of the concern, right? Remember, you also don't have a really robust media in this moment, and there are also not a lot of direct experiences with drug use. So people are kind of taking it as an article of faith, whatever they read in the newspaper or whatever government pronouncements might exist.
In your research, have you ever found any correlation between what was going on in the temperance movement and then prohibition and the drug scene, or the marijuana in particular?
Sure. So my research starts a little bit later in the 20th century. But certainly the progressive ethos, right? The idea that human behavior is correctable was driving the impulse a lot of this legislation, right? So whether it's drugs or alcohol, they're kind of in the same basket of things, right? Thinking about the ability for individuals to, through legislation, right, and the authority of agencies to be able to correct behavior, right, to keep people out of saloons, to stop people from ingesting in substances that might be dangerous, not only for themselves, but also for their families and communities.
The focus of your dissertation and research is the period between, and marijuana use between 1968 and 1996.
Correct.
What changes during that time?
Yeah, so there are a lot of changes, right? And, you know, I have a lot of thoughts about this particular issue, so you can just stop me whenever you need to. When Nixon becomes president, right, one of the things that's really interesting about this time in American history is that there's a fair amount of experimentation with regard to drug policy, right? So Nixon really has a three-pronged solution to addressing drug concerns. One is on the demand side, right? So you can imagine this in thinking about law enforcement, right? So practices that essentially incentivize people to not do drugs, right? So whether it's through aggressive police action or other types of incentives to keep people away from drugs. The second is really supply control, right? So in thinking about a number of treaties with foreign countries, like Turkey, to tie foreign aid specifically, right? So if you're going to keep supplying Americans with drugs, then we're not going to provide you with federal assistance, right? So that's the second group. And then the third is really around treatment and rehabilitation, right? So this idea that we're going to support people who are using drugs, and we want to provide them with services, whether it's health or medical services. And this was a particular concern because soldiers were returning from Vietnam, and there was a significant concern that they would be addicted to heroin, right? And so there was a federal interest in making sure that they didn't flood the streets, whether homeless or whatever. So Nixon really had a robust strategy for dealing with drug policy. That's something that changes over the late 20th and early 21st century, right?
In addition to the Vietnam vets returning, there's an explosion of use of marijuana in the 60s?
So the kind of explosion of marijuana use is roughly tied to the late 60s and early 70s, right? You see the number of people who are using it, which also has significant implications for the criminalization of policy and development of drug policy, right? So if you imagine a situation in which drug use is relatively confined and marijuana use specifically to marginalized citizens, right? So I mentioned the jazz musicians in Harlem or hippies, right, who were protesting in California. You can imagine in which the policy might not be as sympathetic to making sure that those people were incorporated into kind of modern society. But as more middle-class young people started to use drugs, particularly marijuana, there became a greater concern, right, as far as the punitive aspect of drug policy to figure out how people could be not only rehabilitated, but ensure that they weren't kind of locked up for extended periods of time.
One thing must have been feeding the other, because with the more demand, you have supply issues. In other words,
for sure.
This is another problem for government in that time period.
For sure, absolutely. And one of the things that's really challenging about marijuana restrictions is that it's relatively easy to grow, right? You know, its nickname is weed, right, because it grows everywhere. And so people who are really thoughtful about figuring out how to constrain supply were really concerned that a policy that focused too much on it was not going to be successful over the long term. And so they really had to think more about demand, right, reducing interest, thinking about ways to kind of limit the appetite or enthusiasm for marijuana was the only thing that was over the long term going to be a satisfactory response.
Quick question on
Sure.
historical on that weed. Is marijuana a plant indigenous and native to the United States?
That I don't know for sure. If I had to guess, I would say yes, but don't hold me to it.
Let's go to the bookend of your research,
For sure.
1996.
Yes.
Why that date? What happens as we move through the 60s, 70s, and 80s?
Sure. So I'll start with a little bit of a framing based on the time frame. So you have in 1968 the emergence of the Nixon presidency, but also a commission in 1970 called the Schaefer Commission after the former Pennsylvania governor, which mostly populated by Republicans. About 75%, a couple of senators and a couple of congresspersons. And after 2 years of research, they essentially recommend to decriminalize marijuana, right? So this is in 1970, Republican president, a Republican commission comes back with the recommendation that says we shouldn't criminalize possession, right? So that was how I kind of got into the story. And so that was the beginning of the conversations that I was interested in. I'm like, oh, this is really odd to me, how we decide to manage policy in this particular way. How do we get here? 1996 is the Compassionate Use Act in California, which institutes the first really broad medical marijuana program, right? So it starts with really punitive policy and then to this kind of open space for alternative considerations of a marijuana regime, which has led us to kind of the current day.
Well, there's obviously a lot in that time frame alone.
Sure.
You're here at the American Historical Association for a panel on Sunday on what historians wish people knew about the history of licit and illicit drugs.
For sure.
What do you expect to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I like to remind people of is that there are no really good drugs or bad drugs, right? Only constructive ways to use drugs and destructive ways to use drugs, right? And so thinking about kind of an artificial ranking or the problems associated without kind of thinking about the context, I think is problematic. And so to be really thoughtful about analysis with that regard, yeah.
Do you think that this is a topic, an area, in particular in the time frame that you're looking at, that's been combed over very well?
I think especially for historians, a lot of the the documents and archives memos from presidential administrations are just starting to be released. And so it's been combed over, I think, to, journalists have written about it, social scientists have written about it, but historians have really yet to kind of sink their teeth into the material, kind of given the distance needed to be able to place it in appropriate context.
In looking at marijuana compared to alcohol, caffeine, and other drug use, where does marijuana stand today in 2017?
I mean, that's a very interesting question, right? And something I think that advocates who've been supporting more lenient approaches towards punishments associated with marijuana kind of frequently put marijuana in conversation with drugs like tobacco and alcohol, right? And that framing of, is marijuana more similar to those drugs, like caffeine, tobacco, and alcohol, or similar to drugs like heroin or cocaine, in which a lot of the battle is actually fought, right? So if you can place it in the conversation with things that already have kind of a regulatory understanding, people understand that, okay, you can't use it when you drive, it shouldn't be given to young people, right? There's already a system in place to kind of incorporate it into our social fabric, right? Then it's an easier battle for advocates to wage, whether it's, put in conversation with drugs like heroin or cocaine, which seem to be more outside of kind of the mainstream understanding, not only because fewer people use them, but just people have fewer experience with it.
Looking 10 years, 15 years down the road as a historian, if you look back at the election of 2016 and the experience here in Colorado and other states, what do you think in particular those changes will mean historically?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I've kind of taken away from my historical analysis is a very kind of sobering understanding about the possibility for change. And so context is really important. Conditions change. Progress in one area is sometimes rolled back in another. And so I think there will actually be a hard cap on the number of states that essentially decide to legalize marijuana. I think there'll be clusters of places, and we're starting to see that emerge already in the West, in the Southwest, some spaces in the Northeast, for example, when you see Massachusetts and Maine, which in this last legislative session have just decided to legalize marijuana. I think in the Midwest and in the South, there will always be states who are not as excited about the possibilities or prospects of legalizing marijuana, and you'll essentially end up with a federalist solution where you have states, some states decide to legalize it, some states have half measures where they have a medical marijuana regime, and some states that decide to criminalize it.
Back to your PhD research at Princeton, what's the most challenging part of doing research on this topic?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that I started to think about when I was, examining possible topics, I wanted to write a history of the DEA. And it was really challenging because a lot of the records are sealed, right? And so kind of thinking about freedom of information requests, the things that are necessary to get access to the type of documents that would allow you to write a really capacious kind of political history just weren't available, right? And so that's been one of the challenges that I faced, whether going to the archives in Washington, D.C., or trying to collect all the information across a number of states, that it's not necessarily in one place. And even when you have it, it's not necessarily easy to access.
You mentioned finding the results of this Schaefer Commission from the 1970s. What was that the sort of aha moment in terms of finding an area to really focus in on your research?
Yeah, so I'm actually from Atlanta. And so because of that, the first kind of archive that I ended up going to was the Jimmy Carter archives, right? And so the story, which is really fascinating, unfortunately we don't have time to talk about it now, but Jimmy Carter was someone who during his campaign really thought seriously about marijuana decriminalization as a political strategy and an appropriate public policy. And so the first chapter that I ended up writing about my dissertation was on marijuana policy. And then the second chapter, when I went to Washington, D.C., was this interesting Schaefer Commission example. So that's kind of how I was funneled into marijuana specifically. I thought I was going to write this broad drug history that would, probably end up taking me 50 years to get my PhD, but decided to narrow it to marijuana.
Are there many other doctoral students or professors in this field?
For sure, for sure. I definitely think as we think about kind of the significance of mass incarceration in criminal justice policy, there's a new generation of scholars who are really interested in exploring these issues, and that's one of the reasons why I came to the subject matter as well. But I'm definitely interested in looking to the next generation of scholarship.
Beyond this research on marijuana and your doctoral research, what other areas of history are you focusing on or would like to focus on?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. I think my advisor would probably hope that I would focus on this one. But still interested in criminal justice policy broadly, post-World War II policy, kind of social, cultural, intellectual development around a whole host of issues, but thinking more about social policy development.
Here at the American Historical Association, Eugene Hillsman, PhD candidate, Princeton University. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.